Lizzie Borden took an axe, gave her mother 40 whacks. When she saw what she had done, gave her father 41. Welcome to History is Criminal. I'm your host, Mick Biddick. In this episode, we're going to take a look at one of the most famous murders in American history, Lizzie Borden. On the 4th of August, 1892, Lizzie Borden killed her stepmother and her father with a hatchet in a brutal, bloody murder. But did she? In 1892, this crime's brutality and family connections shocked the nation. The belief in her guilt or innocence seemed to be drawn along cultural and socioeconomic lines. At a time of growing nativism in the heart of the Gilded Age, Fall River, Massachusetts was like many places, struggling with the conflict between the old guard and the new arrivals. Andrew Borden was a wealthy man, though he never flaunted it. He lived in a modest, for his wealth, home on 2nd Street, a neighborhood that saw a growing population of upper middle-class Irish Catholics. Andrew lived in the home with his second wife, Abby, daughters Emma, 41, Lizzie, 32, and Bridget Sullivan, their live-in maid, who went by the name of Maggie. At the time of the killings, Andrew's brother-in-law from his first marriage, John Morris, was also staying in the home. And the Borden daughters longed to move from their changing neighborhood to the Hill, a neighborhood populated by wealthy Protestant ruling class. It had reportedly become an issue of some discontent in the Borden home. Some in the town also said both Borden girls, hardly girls at this point in their 30s and 40s, didn't like their stepmother, who they believed married Andrew for his money. There was clearly tension in the Borden home, but was it enough to kill over? It was a hot August morning on the 4th, and things started fairly normal. At 7 a.m., Andrew and John had breakfast together, while Abby and Maggie started the housework. Around 8, Lizzie had her breakfast. Emma was 15 miles out of town visiting a friend. About 8:45, John left and was followed shortly by Andrew. Approximately at 9, sometime around 9:30, Abby headed upstairs to do housework, and Maggie went outside to do chores that included washing the windows. At 10:30, Maggie came back into the house just for a minute before heading back outside. She reported that at that time she heard some laughing coming from upstairs and thought it must be Lizzie. Lizzie would deny having ever been upstairs that morning. At 11, Andrew returned home and Maggie led him in the house. Lizzie spoke to her father, telling him that a messenger had arrived at the house looking for Abby that morning and that she had left the house. Then he apparently lied down on the couch to take a quick nap. Maggie went upstairs to her room on the 3rd floor to rest. Shortly after reaching her room, Maggie heard Lizzie yelling for her. "Maggie, come down! Come quick! Father's dead! Somebody came in and killed him!" Once she came into the room, she would have seen Andrew, a bloody mess, lying on the couch. Lizzie told her to go get Dr. Seaborn Bowen, the family doctor. It could be important to note here that 3 Irish doctors lived practically on each side of the Borden home. Was it just that Lizzie could only think of Dr. Bowen at the time? Or did she specifically want him to come for a reason? Police were notified and started to arrive at 11:15. Neighbors also started to come into the Borden home, drawn by the commotion. One of these neighbors said they needed to get a sheet to cover Andrew's body, at which time Maggie reportedly said, "We'll need 2." And Maggie, at this point, refused to go upstairs. Now, no one had discovered Abby's body upstairs at this point. So was Maggie just afraid? After all, there had been a murder in the house and no one had checked upstairs. Or did she, as some speculated, already know Abby was lying dead upstairs? In any case, it was at this point that they did go upstairs and found Abby lying next to her bed. Her head was a bloody mess, just like Andrew. This was now a double homicide. Doctors said that Abby was standing at the time of the attack. They said she was attacked by, quote, a tall man who struck the woman from behind. However, Abby was only 5'3", so her attacker did not actually have to be that tall. She had 19 wounds from a hatchet, not an axe, in the back of her head. Clearly, the attacker continued to strike her after she fell. It would seem this type of overkill must have had some kind of rage behind it. In the timeline, it was estimated that she may have died up to an hour to an hour and a half before Andrew. Andrew, who was reclining on the sofa when he was attacked, was struck between 10 and 11 times in the face with a hatchet. That seems like a very personal attack. 10 to 11 strikes in the face with a hatchet. Autopsy photos show his face is completely gone. Again, there seemed to be some real rage in these murders. Neither Abby or Andrew seemed to have put up any type of defense. Did they know their killer, or was this a total ambush killing? Lizzie and Maggie were the only people reported being in the home at the time of the killing. Maggie seems to have been ruled out quickly. Was it Lizzie's statement that Maggie had left the room and gone upstairs that seemed to rule her out? At first, police focused on the possibility of a foreign killer. This, of course, being an age of overwhelming nativism. The evil foreigner must be lurking somewhere. A Portuguese workman had come by the house earlier that morning looking for payment for a job he had done for Andrew. Andrew told him he didn't have any money at the time and he'd have to come back later. But it seems that police quickly gave up on this angle and suspicion fell on John Morse. But people around town claimed to have seen John at the time of the murders, an alibi that at times has been questioned. Newspapers began to cover the story with great interest. In Fall River, there were two papers, the Fall River Evening News, an older, more established paper preferred by the wealthy Protestant town leaders, and the Fall River Globe, which was owned by John Coughlin. Coughlin was also the second Irish Catholic ever elected mayor in Fall River. Both papers were pressuring police to find the killer sooner than later. But within 3 days of the killing, the Globe was starting to point the finger at Lizzie. The Evening News would come to her defense, refusing to believe that a, quote, Protestant nun such as Lizzie could commit such a heinous act. Soon the town found itself divided along political, economic, and religious lines. For many, Lizzie had become the symbol of oppressed women all across the country. Temperance movement groups, along with suffragettes, came to her defense. One thing that had the police baffled was a lack of blood at the scene. The murders had been brutal. One could assume that the killer should be soaked in blood. The timeline, at best, from Maggie heading upstairs to Lizzie calling her down for help was 15 minutes. That would mean Lizzie would have had to have killed her father, disposed of the hatchet, cleaned herself, and changed her clothes all before yelling for Maggie. No axe or hatchet found on the Borden property had blood on it. And all they had found on Lizzie was one small drop of blood on the hem of her dress. Police questioned Lizzie at the time of the discovery of the bodies. She seemed confused and distracted at times. Dr. Bauer later said he had given her some morphine to calm her down before she spoke to the police. To be honest, in the 1800s, they threw morphine around like it was Pez. The anti-Lizzie press started to paint a picture of her as a young lady with motive. The Daily Globe ran a story claiming that Lizzie had issues with her stepmother. Quote, Lizzie and her stepmother never got along peacefully, and for considerable time they have not spoken. She also gave an alibi, although a weak one, saying that at the time of her father's murder she had gone out to the barn to look for some fishing weights for an upcoming fishing trip. Police discounted this by saying that the barn loft had undisturbed dust, like no one had been up there for quite a while. They also claimed that the heat in the barn loft was so bad that no one could have stayed up there for more than 15 or 20 minutes looking for weights for a trip that was not going to take place for a few days. There are a couple interesting things that come up here, though. There was a group of workmen who had worked in the Borden house who claimed that they had been up in that loft just a day or two before, throwing in some question how there ended up with so much undisturbed dust, if in fact there was any undisturbed dust. There's some questions about the makeup of the police department. It had changed over the years leading up to the Borden murders and had become populated with people who came from the socioeconomic group that was a little more anti-Borden, anti the Protestant ruling class. Is it possible they had some grudge against the wealthy ruling class? Who knows? But it would be Lizzie's friend who would give the police what they needed to make an arrest. Alice Russell stayed with Lizzie in the Borden home the night after the murders. The bodies were still on tables on the first floor. They were not taken to a morgue, nor were they refrigerated in any way, so this had to be a pretty gruesome evening. It's understandable that Lizzie and her sister, who had returned home, wouldn't want to be alone in the murder house, but it's not clear why they didn't leave. Later, when questioned, Alice said Lizzie did nothing or said nothing incriminating, but later she changed her story, saying she saw Lizzie burn a blue dress on the family stove. It was then that they moved to indict Lizzie. The trial would take place the following June. It was an absolute sensation. Lizzie as a money-hungry killer who wanted to get her father and stepmother out of the way in order to live the lavish lifestyle that her father had prevented. The defense would focus on what was an alarming lack of physical evidence. The prosecution had no murder weapon, though they did produce a hatchet head with no handle that might have been the murder weapon. The hatchet was found on the roof of a neighbor's barn near the edge of the Borden property. That hatchet was not found until June 14th, almost a year after the crime, but in the middle of the trial when a boy climbed on the roof to get his ball. When the boy saw the hatchet, he yelled, "I found Lizzie Borden's axe." The convenientness and the timing didn't seem to raise many questions. The barn's owner stated that no one had been on that roof in almost 2 years. The majority of the case seemed to have been built on what witnesses said they heard in the days leading up to the murder. Maggie was the first witness called, and much of the timeline is based on what she had to say. She said Lizzie was the only person she saw in the house after Andrew left, and she didn't see anyone other than Andrew and Lizzie after he'd returned home. As for the relationship between Lizzie and Abby, she stated she had never witnessed any bad blood between the two. This was countered by the testimony of Hannah Gifford, who had made a dress for Lizzie in the weeks before the murder. According to her, Lizzie had said her stepmother was, quote, a mean, good-for-nothing thing, and that I don't have much to do with her. I stay in my room most of the time. The doctor leading the forensic investigation, or what passed for forensics in 1892, said the way the killing took place pointed to a woman. Hacking is almost a positive sign of a deed by a woman who is unconscious of what she is doing. So this overkill had to be a woman because women don't know how to kill. Seems like an odd conclusion. The prosecution also called people to testify as to what Lizzie was doing in the days leading up to the killing. A pharmacist reported that she had bought a type of poison in the days before the killing, but this was tossed out as irrelevant because that particular chemical also had numerous household uses. A friend of Lizzie's said that she had told her, quote, I feel depressed as if something's hanging over me at times, no matter where I am." Supposedly, she said this just days before the murder. They also questioned how it was possible for Lizzie not to hear the attack on her stepmother or hear Abby fall on the floor. It was reported that Abby weighed nearly 200 pounds, so her falling to the floor would have been audible downstairs. Lizzie's defense focused on the idea that many people were able to state that an unknown young man had been seen around Fall River around the time of the murders. Her sister Emma also testified that Lizzie lacked motive for the killings. They also leaned heavily on the idea that this violent, horrible crime had to be committed by some maniac, not a refined woman like Lizzie Andrew Borden. Yeah, that's right. Her father gave her his name as her middle name. Lizzie might have had a little bit of an ace in the hole. The jury was selected of 11 of the leading Protestants, people who lived on the hill, and only one of the Irish residents. The Superior Court was also manned by a judge who was appointed to the bench by Lizzie's lawyer when he had served as governor. Can you say conflict of interest? Defense attorney George Robinson, a top trial lawyer and former governor, gave an impassioned closing that was openly applauded by supporters of Lizzie in the courtroom. In addition, the jury directions given by the judge basically supported the defense case. The jury deliberated for about an hour before returning a verdict of not guilty on all charges. Most papers praised the jury for their findings. The New York Times was especially harsh on the Fall River police after the trial. They said they had acted with, quote, vanity of ignorant, untrained men charged with detection of crime, and continued by calling them, quote, the usual inept, stupid, muddle-headed that such small towns manage to get for themselves. So New York Times, a little harsh on the Fall River police. If Lizzie did kill her father and stepmother, the prosecution failed to meet their burden of proof. The evidence was at best circumstantial, and even by the standards of the day, the investigation failed to do due diligence. They allowed numerous people to enter the crime scene and failed to secure much in the way of real evidence, other than the burned dress, which Lizzie said she had destroyed because it had paint on it. They didn't show any actions on her part pointing to guilt. The timeline showing Abby killed 1 to 2 hours before Andrew would require Lizzie to have gone totally psycho, then calmly wait 1 to 2 hours for her father to come home, then calmly, according to Maggie, talk with her father, then, boom, smack him in the face 10 to 11 times with a hatchet. It was also suggested that the only way she could have committed the murders and not have been covered in blood would to have been totally naked at the time, adding one more wrinkle to her ability to kill, clean up, hide the weapon, change, all between the time of Maggie heading upstairs and being called back down. That seems like an incredibly tight timeline. So, if Lizzie was not the killer, then who was? One possibility, Lizzie and Maggie were in on it together. This cleans up a lot of issues with the timeline. It gives the two of them hours to kill Abby, then kill Andrew before going to get the doctor. It would also explain Lizzie never having pointed the finger at Maggie. But why would the two of them work together? One theory is that they shared a mutual hatred of Abby. There's nothing that supports Maggie disliking Abby, but it fits with the class warfare argument that some like to squeeze into the case. Others have a more scandalous suggestion that Lizzie and Maggie were lovers. Now, while this fits the scandalous nature of the crime, and some evidence does support the possibility of Lizzie being a lesbian, nothing happened after the case that fits the two of them as being lovers. Lizzie and Emma bought a fancy new house on the hill, and Maggie left to live a quiet life away from the Bordens. Then it was suggested that it was Lizzie's boyfriend. In this theory, an unnamed boyfriend killed Andrew and Abby. They claimed that Andrew did not approve of the match and refused to give his blessing. Enraged, the boyfriend snuck into the house, killing Abby, and then lied in wait until Andrew came home. Killing Andrew, he hoped Lizzie would get at least half of the family's money, and then they could run off together. The issues with this scenario are quite obvious. First of all, there's no known or even rumored boyfriend of Lizzie. Once again, Lizzie didn't run off after the murders, but stayed in town, despite her being ostracized by the entire community to the point that she couldn't even go to church. Then there's Uncle John. John had come to town with very few belongings, didn't seem to have much of a plan. He was also a butcher who regularly carried a meat cleaver with him. Without modern forensics, it could be very difficult to tell the difference between an injury caused by a hatchet and one caused by a meat cleaver. John's motive could have been simple greed. He could have asked for money from Andrew only to get turned down and become angry, or he was hoping on stealing money or jewelry from the home. As for his alibi, some people question how good his alibi really was. It seemed that later some witnesses couldn't be sure if it was him they saw walking around town the whole time during the murders. Then there is the possibility of a random psycho killer killing both Abby and Andrew. People say they had seen a stranger in town in the days leading up to the murder. Of course, a lot of those witnesses were saying it was a foreigner, most likely fed by the strong nativist sentiments at the time. If an unknown stranger was responsible, then it leads to the idea that he broke into the house sometime that morning, killed Abby, hid in the house while both Lizzie and Maggie came in and out without touching either one of them or being seen by either one of them before killing Andrew. The killer then made his escape, again without being seen by either Maggie or Lizzie. The most interesting and convoluted theory is one of a full-on conspiracy. This version of events, Andrew had an illegitimate son, possibly named William or Charles. This unknown Borden came to the house that morning demanding to be included in Andrew's will. When Andrew refused, the son became full of rage and killed. This is spelled out in a 1991 book by Arnold L. Brown, Lizzie Borden, The Legend, the Truth, and the Final Chapter. In this version of the story, Lizzie and Emma knew of the murder, and Lizzie might have witnessed it. With the help of the family doctor, Bowen, they would cover up for the brother. Lizzie agreed to take the blame, knowing she would never be found guilty. Worst case scenario, if the trial started to go the wrong way, they could always come forward with the real killer. It sounds like a great plan. There are some issues with this theory. Both William and Charles Borden did live in the area at the time, but their birth records show them as being born to a different man named Borden, no relation, and so this does tend to throw a little bit of a kibosh on the whole William or Charles Borden being the killer. That does not necessarily rule out a third Borden boy that nobody knew about. Is it possible that there was a mentally ill Borden boy who was responsible for the murders? Then there's the other Borden sister, Emma. Emma was 15 miles away the morning of the murders. Some claim she could have secretly rode back into town in her buggy, committed the murders, and then returned to her alibi. She would have the same motive as Lizzie, the family's money. The girls did move to a much nicer home and lived a much more lavish lifestyle after the murders. The sisters lived together until something caused a falling out in 1905. At that point, Emma moved out of the house. The falling out is said to have something to do with Lizzie's new friend, Nance O'Neill, who was an out lesbian, which pretty rare in 1905. While living in their new fancy house, Emma seemed to become more religious, but Lizzie, shunned by the church, began to hang out with actors and other bohemian types. Lover or not, this new friendship drove a wedge between the sisters, who never spoke again. Lizzie died on the 1st of June, 1927, at 66 years old, due to issues following a gallbladder surgery. Emma died 9 days later from falling down her back steps. While death from falling down the steps makes that sound somewhat questionable, the reality is when she fell down the steps, she fractured her hip, which led to complications causing her death. The two were buried in the family plot with their father and stepmother. They left their sizable fortunes to various charitable causes. In the end, the truth of what happened that morning at the Borden home might never be known. Documentaries, books, movies, both made for TV and theatrical releases, have all given their take on the story. I focused on crimelibrary.org and famoustrials.com for most of my information, but there are mountains of information out there if you want to dig deeper into the Lizzie Borden murders. This has been History is Criminal. Come back in a week and we'll jump into another one of history's dark criminal stories.